Okay, yeah, that's my intro. Hello, I'm Jasmine or ArtCTO on Instagram. In this video, I'll show you how I usually render faces, and these are just some of the works I've done. I know that there's been a lot of discussion in the art community about art styles and stuff like that recently. I encourage you to choose the bits and pieces you like from this tutorial and turn it into your own. So there's no need to fixate on the small details and get worked up over trying to make your drawing look exactly the same.
And just a little disclaimer, this is a stylized rendering tutorial on how I do things. I do not claim this to be anatomically or technically correct in any way.
Okay, so this is the flat color that I'll be using today. I already have the hair and eyes rendered. You're just going to create a new clipping layer on top of the flat color and use a big airbrush to place your blush. I prefer to not make the blush a little too long on the face, but it's all up to personal preference. You can see here that I made it a little bit shorter, and I just personally like how that looks. And then you're going to create another clipping layer on top of that. I use a regular watercolor brush and draw in the aegyo, pardon my pronunciation, and then I like to use a smudge brush and smudge in the corners to smoothen it out. I'll also use the same brush to color in the lips like you see here, and then I'll use the smudge tool to kind of smooth out the corners so it isn't as harsh. Then on the same layer, I'll take an airbrush and color in the eyelids, add some gradients to the aegyo and the lips. I recommend turning on alpha lock, which will limit your work to the pixels you've already set down on the canvas. Okay, this part's important. Go back to your blush layer and erase with an airbrush like you see I'm doing here. And then you're going to create a new layer underneath the blush layer. Color select like a cool color. I recommend taking an airbrush and color picking on the edge like you see I'm doing here to get like a more cool version of the skin tone, and I'm just going to airbrush that lightly in that erased section you see and in the lower part of the face. Create a new layer on top of all of that, set to multiply, and take a big airbrush with a muted color and just lightly airbrush the edge of the face. You don't want it to be too stark or too much contrast, just gently. And then I like to take a smudge brush and make that a little bit softer. And then you see me here just rendering the neck. This isn't a neck anatomy video. Okay, so on that same multiply layer, you're just going to take another like watercolor brush and then create like these shapes just for the nose bridge. If depending on like the character's facial structure, it is going to look a little different and probably a little less harsh. This is my favorite part, erasing like around the inner corner of the eye. Just to get like those edges and a little bit more definition. And then I'm going to take an airbrush with a lighter color and kind of make it a little softer so it isn't too stark on the face. Again, I recommend turning on your alpha lock just so it doesn't get everywhere. Okay, and here you see me just kind of going back to the lip layer and adding some more color. I usually add that on the upper lip and towards the center of the lips. Then I'll create a new layer on top of everything, set it to multiply, take a smaller watercolor brush in a muted color, and create like an outline along the jaw, adding some shadows because of the hair and some shadows on the nose. I'll use a smudge tool to kind of smudge out the nose shading so it isn't as intense. And then I'm adding some shading to the lips, usually around that like middle line, and then I'll put it at the bottom. A big portion of my art process is just kind of guessing and checking, and so you'll see that I go back and redo the lips. I did want to keep as much of the process as I could in this video just so you guys could slow it down in case you wanted to see all the details. Here you see I'm taking a light airbrush and just using that on the shadows. I think it makes it look nice rather than just one solid color. And now I'm adding some highlights around the eyes just to make it look a little crispy, like shiny. And here I'm adding in the highlights around the mouth. I'll just take a light color, maybe like a yellowish or orange, and then I'll add some to the corners of the mouth. Okay, this part's kind of important. On top of all those layers, create a new one. Color pick your shadow color. Go to all the way to the opposite side of the color wheel, like this blue here. Use the airbrush, color select the outer part of the airbrush, and then draw on the innermost parts of the shadow. Now I'm just adding in highlights. I also just chose blue for this. Just make it look nice, you know, like however you want. I like to usually add it like near the eyes, and then now I'm adding it on the lips, obviously on the nose. One thing I have to say though is that my art style doesn't really account for like different types of lighting. Like my characters are always just sitting in the white void. So maybe take that into consideration when you're drawing. I usually have 2 layers of highlights. So the first one will be like the crisper highlights, like the blue parts that you see on the drawing. And then below that I'll have an airbrush layer just so I can make things look more glowy. It's all up to personal preference though. And then I like to finish everything off with the pizza hack, just make that shape with an airbrush and then set the layer to soft light and adjust to your liking, and I think it just makes it look softer. Okay, and this is pretty much the end. I hope it was helpful. My explanations were probably not as detailed as you would hope, but you're welcome to slow down the video and rewind. I don't know how you got here, but thanks for watching. Bye bye.